Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent new podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers across specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. This is episode 5, and the focus is on Latin American political violence. I'm your host, David Benyon. I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by multiple guests. It's a busier episode than usual, through the magic of Zoom. So firstly, in Miami, I'm very pleased to welcome Napoleon Montes-Amaya, who's head of Hiscox Miami, which is Hiscox Group Gateway to Latin America. I'm also joined by Mario Andrés Salcedo, head of terrorism and political violence for Latin America at Howden, based in Bogota, and Tom Bradbrook, executive director, global head of terrorism and political violence at Howden, based in London. Geographically speaking, it's quite a panel of guests, so we're spanning 2 oceans and 3 continents to deliver you some insights today into this key specialty line of insurance. And I'd like to try and split today's content into 3 simple sections. So we'll start by looking back at some of the big civil unrest events that have occurred in recent years and shaped this market. We'll discuss the rapid development of standalone PV business. And then finally, we'll spend a good portion of our time looking at some potential future triggers for PV in the region. The Chilean riots were sparked by something as simple as the cost of a metro ticket. But when you look at these events and those in Peru and Colombia that have continued until as recently as this year, is the common uniting factor that of economic inequality? Mario, if you could kick things off for us, please.
I would say that in response to your question, I would say that that is a common factor in all of these events. As you said, for example, in Chile, what sparked the riots was the increase in the metro fare in Santiago. But it has many factors behind, such as income inequality, high cost of living, privatization of social services, and police intervention, which re-sparked the riots during the event. The curiosity about Chile, what I mentioned to everyone, is that Chile before 2019 was seen as the Switzerland of Latin America, and all of this happened. So like the message with this is that it could happen anywhere, but in these 3 cases, the main common factor was economic inequality, healthcare crisis. In Colombia, for example, in 2019 and 2021, what sparked the riots was a tax reform that was going to be introduced by the current government at that time. But it also had all these issues behind, that had been going on for many, many years and many governments. Also adding to that, corruption from politics. And the people in Colombia and in these countries, we know about corruption in politics, but there's not much that you can do about it. And when you get like new people into government that try to do the correct thing, they get eaten by the political machinery, or they have to align with the other traditional politics, or they get kicked out practically. So yeah, it's very sad that we have this situation in these countries. And then Peru, last year, it all broke down, or the outbreak was because of President Castillo trying to dissolve the Congress, and then he was impeached before he was able to do that and arrested. And like the supporters of Castillo throughout the country, mainly in the south, started these protests and riots and causing many damages. I would say that, just to conclude there, this first part, that the event with the most insured damages and economic damages, and the biggest one was Chile. But then all these events were very important to the economy of Colombia, Peru, and Chile as well.
Just to touch on Mario's point as well, just about economic inequality, is that, if you take Chile, for instance, the riots that started, they start off politically motivated, but towards the back end of these riots, you saw a lot of looting and a lot of damages and looting following. So even though they might start off politically motivated, I think a lot of it ended more criminal.
Napo, would you agree?
I agree. I mean, nowadays, it's really economic disparity or inequality. It's just not a problem for Latin America. And we just have to keep in mind that Latin America has traditionally been one of the most unequal regions of the world, right? So Brazil and Mexico typically have one of the largest Gini coefficients in the world. And you wouldn't be surprised to see that almost every Latin American country has a high level of inequality. So it's not surprising that we are facing this amount of social unrest, and it's certainly political.
Maybe in one respect, more of it, to call it a uniting factor, would be that perhaps social media has played an important role in this, in escalating civil unrest.
Yeah, I think social media plays a huge role in civil unrest. Not necessarily the actual cause of the riots, but actually making it worse. You've got the sort of power of Facebook and instant messaging these days that you can organise large groups of people, not just localised, but across borders. So, yeah, I mean, look, in previous years when social media was not around or it was low, these type events remained localised. So, damages might have occurred within city centres or within local towns. But I think, with the power of social media now and how far that can reach, you're not just seeing huge escalations in specific countries, but you're also seeing cross-border stuff as well. So I think social media, and I think markets are potentially worried with social media of systemic losses. So, not losses that are going to be occurred in a specific country, but losses for the same sort of event that can occur worldwide. Yeah, I think it's played a huge factor in recent years, especially with Chile. And I think it's going to be a big method for civil unrest in the future.
100%. What social media has come to do is just be a catalyst, right? As in accelerate the speed of not only how news travel, but it's actually of organization, which is probably the most worrisome part of this. It's not just getting that contagion effect. If you look at historically, right? So having contagion effects is not something new. Latin America, in fact, we are our own region because we had the contagion effect of the French Revolution. And if you see when all of our countries became independent, it was actually during the same decade. And it was a contagion effect back then. And I think it was O'Higgins, San Martin, and Bolivar that studied together in Spain who brought some of those French Revolution ideals over to this part of the world and started getting spread out. But it took 10 years. More or less, for that wave to take over Latin America. Nowadays, in 2019, it took about 3 weeks to have issues across Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia. So I think that's the true example of how deep and how quick social media has just on social unrest.
And I would like to add there that I think it's not a secret that there are some organizations that benefit from these events in these countries. And social media gives the power, to these organizations, as Napo said, to organize the people and influence the more influential side of the population to go and support these events. So yeah, it contributes to make very large events instead of localized situations.
So moving on to the way that the market has developed since some of these events, in the last 3 or 4 years, an immediate consequence of these events, Chile in particular, has been the exclusion of SRCC from property all risks. Since then, we've seen spectacular growth within the standalone political violence market. Howden referred to this in their April 2023 report called A World of Trouble. And my question really is whether that explosive growth in PV happened overnight. Has it been immediate, or has it been a slow burn? Relatively slow burn, and has it been consistent across borders?
Prior to Chile, there was a lot more emphasis in our market on standard sabotage and terrorism cover. I think we were more of a terrorism market. Obviously, in certain areas, SRCC was already big and political violence, including war, was big. But I personally believe that 2019 with Chile turned our market a little bit. I personally believe that we're a much more of an SRCC market now. I'm not saying terrorism's an afterthought, and it's not, but I think there's a greater emphasis on the SRCC and war perils now than there has ever been before. That is mainly due to big events that have happened over the last 3 or 4 years. You had Chile in late 2019. It was one of the first SRCC events that you've seen that sort of physical damage, and it was huge. We then had South Africa riots in 2021, which was another big event. And obviously 2022, you've now got the war in Ukraine, which has highlighted the need for war. So I think the events have shaped our market. And I think that there's a lot more emphasis on SRCC. I think, if you read through the report that Howden did, SRCC events over the last 3 years, especially in areas like Africa and Latin America, have actually exceeded natural catastrophe losses. Now, we're still a young market. We're 23, 24 years old, and we've always had a relatively low loss ratio. To actually hear that we're exceeding nat cat losses in regions or continents such as Africa and Latin America is huge. So since 2019 and since obviously 21, we have seen quite a big change in our market. I wouldn't necessarily say that the product has been more restricted. We're quite a set wording market, so the coverages are still there. The market is still here to support those perils. But yeah, I would say that the market has become more restricted over the last 3 or 4 years. Appetite has changed. I think the big events that have happened have shown underwriters the damages that could occur. And, if markets are writing too much in city centres, with the escalations that we've seen, there's a big danger of suffering multiple losses. So the appetite is definitely a key factor that's changed over the last 3 years. Reduced lines. Napo might be able to speak a bit more, but we have seen reduced cover. We've seen extensions that in previous years have been given for free that have reduced, like non-damage, denial of access, those sort of extensions. But just to go back to your original question, SRCC, especially in Latin America, a lot of that has been under the all risk, like terrorism was prior to September the 11th. And what we have noticed from a broker's perspective over the last 2 or 3 years is actually a lot of that business is now moving away from the all risk market and going into the standalone market. Now, there could be various reasons for that. One of the main reasons is actually the all risk market looking at it and thinking that they're charging for fire, for natural catastrophe. And actually, SRCC has its own standalone market, and that's where the professionals are. And that's where those extensions should be. And obviously, as I just highlighted, if you have a look at our report and you can see that, in recent years, SRCC losses have overtaken that cat, you can see why that transition is happening.
An 80% rise in PV pricing, that is globally, but since 2018. So Napo, when you moved to Miami from New York, it was to build out a book for this business. So you're probably the best placed person here to talk about underwriting growth in premium and also the pricing gains in that time period.
I moved to Miami in 2012 to start the book from scratch for Hiscox. And I can tell you that in this 11 years, it's a whole different new world, really. Like Tom said, in 2012, the market was mostly a sabotage and terrorism market, with a few exceptions like Colombia, because of historical reasons, I've always buy SRCC, and actually Peru as well. Used to be a buyer of SRCC, but, premium levels were actually very low. And in fact, I can tell you that amongst my other fellow underwriters here in Miami, this would be a joke, right? Because they said, you never play a claim, because truly Latin America enjoyed about a great period of growth and I would say social peace and bonanza, really, basically since more or less the 90s. Perhaps with the exception of Argentina in 2001, there really were no significant outbreaks of social unrest. There's always been incidents in certain industry types, like mining or forestry, or always issues when it comes to land rights in places like Mexico, Brazil, Chile again. There's always been, but there were never massive concerns over political violence. As a line of business, we were almost seen as we never played claims, And then starting 2017, things started changing with the gasolinazo in Mexico, and then 2019 changes. And I think it's been a bit of a vindication for a product line within the insurance market. And, and the fact that what Tom and the Howden report mentions, that it is crazy to think that in a region like Latin America, where we have hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, basically every sort of natural catastrophe that you want, yet over the last few years, there's been more losses paid for political violence than that cat. That's really, really crazy. And the trend continues to see, particularly SRCC being excluded from treaties. And that's really ramping up demand for the product. And it makes sense. A lot of people tell me, but why? The worst has already happened. But just like we discussed, in the opening questions, we're probably at a point in history where the world itself it has seen the most level of economic inequality, and we have digital napalm bombs like social media who come and actually completely expedite the organization process of social unrest. So I think every business leader and every state leader is concerned about social unrest. And unfortunately, I don't think it's actually going to get any better anytime soon. The new generations, I think that there's another social element within all of this, which is, Gen Z is actually a generation that is driven by precisely social media and conspicuous consumption, right? And the world we see it, if you want to mix a bit of sport, looking at what all these players are getting paid, either in golf by going to live or football going to the Saudi, all of this is actually not very good when it comes to social unrest, because people want immediate satisfaction and want to become rich from one way to the other. And we're seeing all of these problems with high-end brands. I mean, look at what's going on with California right now, the amount of looting. It is just crazy. So I don't think, unfortunately, I have a very nice story to tell for what's forthcoming. But for a product line, it's actually something very good. Just because, like Tom said, I like to say that our product line is finally coming to adulthood. The first years, we were true teenagers, but now our wordings, which is actually something very good for our clients, have been tested. And in most cases, actually, the standalone wordings have proved to be a lot better than the cover provided by the old risk policies, actually. In Chile, there's still litigation going on right now for clients who had their protection included or embedded in the old risks. Meanwhile, I think all of us who have standalone policies, that's done and dusted. I don't think, at least from our side, we don't have any open claims from 2019 in Chile. So I don't think the old risk market can actually say that. So those are all the good things that are happening for our marketplace.
One question that springs to mind, it's not one that I thought to ask, but comparing PV with another standalone market that's either coming of age or has been around for at least a decade, it's cyber. I mean, I read a report recently that, that market is going to be somewhat constrained by the fact that reinsurers don't really want to write it as much as the primary market does. What's the situation in PV?
I don't think PV is nowhere close to where cyber is. I mean, I'm no expert in cyber, but cyber is a highly dynamic product and just world overall, right? So technology keeps evolving and threat keeps evolving, and there are so many unknowns. PV has, I would say, more of your traditional insurance unknowns, right? The biggest problem that we had in PV and why there's been a big retraction of capacity, it's because of what I mentioned before. We were seen as a product line that didn't have any losses. Therefore, rates were highly inadequate. So they truly cut us with our pants down.
Capacity was obviously, at an all-time high as well, Napo, wasn't it? That, because of the low loss ratios, markets were writing pretty huge lines per risk.
Correct. I mean, capacity is not coming back the way it was in the past, but I think that it's now at a very healthy level. And actually, frankly, a lot of the underwriters on PV probably have seen their first loss in this last few years. So there's also a lot more experience in what is having a loss, underwriting a loss. So yeah, I think the market is ready. It's not to continue to provide solutions for the clients.
Latin America, Central South America is a continent that we're seeing by far the biggest increases and changes in premium. And the proof in the pudding there is because of the events and the losses that have occurred. Whether Chile, a lot of that fell under the all risk rather than the standalone market. But in terms of the actual events, and there's various reasons for that. As I said earlier on, there's also line size changes, appetite changes. If there's a lot of demand and less appetite in the market, that's going to increase price. So I still think we're going through a little bit of a transitional phase at the moment. I still think that there's a lot more attention on terms and conditions, deductible levels, extensions, obviously rates. But I think in general, worldwide, our product rates are increasing. But personally, from our experience, I would say that Central South America is seeing the highest.
To add there, I would say just that there's capacity for the clients, but right now the underwriters are in need of more time to underwrite more specific information. So the coverage can get done and will get done, but it also depends on the quality of information that we get from the client. So that's very important to highlight that there is interest, there is appetite, not with huge lines from one single underwriter as before, but it can be done and with help of the clients as well.
Between us on this podcast, we've got one person in Miami, we've got another in London, we've got another in Bogota. So Mario, does it help you being on the ground within one country in this region where there is a lot of this business being done, that you can get closer to the risk?
Yes, totally. Look, like I think this was like a great initiative from Howden to leave me in charge of political violence in the region and have somebody locally for both sides, to be able to speak with the clients. First of all, the same language, the same time zone, and be like available there for them almost 24/7. Obviously, being direct part of the London team is great because we can bring all the capacity that's there in the main hub worldwide. And also I can access directly the local markets, which are mainly in Miami. And the other way also, I think it helps a lot the clients because I've lived the current events and situations that have been going on in the region, particularly in Colombia. And I can transmit the message to the underwriters in London that it's not as the news shows it, that maybe over there, like the people can think that we were living in a war zone. No, you could go out in the streets and there are like specific places where things were going on, but it wasn't as bad as it looked in the news. And for example, I remember the first cases when everything in Colombia started to happen, everybody started thinking that it was going to be the same as in Chile. And no, we had to send the message accordingly that it wasn't the same situation. It wasn't going to have huge losses. It did have losses, but not the same amount as in Chile. So it helps a lot to make the underwriters, mainly in London, realize that they could be a little bit more flexible regarding on what they think and what they see through the news that they get.
Napo, obviously from your perspective, not in London, but in Miami, as a gateway market for Latin America, do you want to give us the view from Miami, how you see it?
Yeah, been here for 11 years, and we were the second market because there was somebody else before us who probably was here 6 to 12 months before we did. And you can tell the difference. We probably are two of the markets who are a lot better than other syndicates throughout this tumultuous years of, social unrest. And let's also be honest, Latin America, it's a tricky region when it comes to idiosyncrasies of doing business, right? And just like every other part of the world, right? Everybody has their own way of negotiating. Everybody has their own way of doing business. So having someone locally, that adds huge amounts to the way that we do business here because we understand that. And not to obviously give ourselves props here, but I think something that differentiates both of our companies, Howden and Hiscox, is that we actually have, Mario being in Bogota and being Latin, and ourselves here having a strong team, as well as underwriters who have gone through it, have lived it, and truly understand the Latin American market from a standpoint that an outsider can't. So yes, it makes huge difference to have local presence.
So let's talk about future triggers. So I'm always intrigued by global connectedness and geopolitics. We're seeing a lot of that with, for example, something like PV and LatAm can be influenced by events in Ukraine. We're seeing in a grain port like Odessa in the Black Sea. How can events across the oceans like that act as an indirect trigger or an influence to PV somewhere as far away as Latin America, somewhere like Peru?
It's a very good question, a very, very key point in our market. And I know this is something that reinsurers are looking at quite closely. If you take the Nat Cat market or the fire market, our product is slightly different because if you take the war in Ukraine, our markets have been writing PV insurance in Ukraine. So we've been writing risks for war cover. So when obviously the conflict started, our markets in London and overseas are picking up losses that are caused directly between the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But I think what this has also shown from a systemic point of view is how events can occur after that war in Ukraine that can affect other countries throughout the world. So as an example that you just said, like Peru, the war in Ukraine has caused an energy crisis, and there's been a lot of products from Ukraine that can't go worldwide. And it might not be the complete root cause of the protests in Peru, but one of the reasons for the rioting in Peru is social inequality. And that is due to rise in prices that's been a direct cause from the energy crisis. They're a mineral-rich country, Peru, and they need certain products from around the world. And when there's a shortage of that, that will cause recessions, unemployment rates. And that's one of the reasons why there's certain unrest in Peru. So I think what the war in Ukraine showed us is that the energy crisis that followed, that potentially adds other losses. So markets aren't just covering the upfront losses in Ukraine, they're also seeing an effect worldwide by that war. So, I think it's a worry for reinsurers, because what we have started to see is systemic losses that are happening throughout the world. So one event could cause markets multiple losses. Another point I'll raise is COVID-19. COVID was a worldwide issue. I think we're seeing protesting and civil unrest, which is a root cause of COVID-19. You have unemployment, you have recessions, you have high inflation, and a lot of localized issues are caused with that. And it causes people to go onto the streets. If people can't afford food or they haven't got enough money to live, the first thing they'll do is go and cause unrest, whether they're targeting the government with that or whether they're, as I said previously, they're targeting retail outlets because they want clothes or food or whatever. So, I think COVID-19 was a good point to bring up, because that fueled a lot of tensions around the world. And our product really, from a politically motivated perspective, is picking up those losses.
Well, just to add there to what Tom said and connecting the dots, well, actually, the tax reform that I mentioned that triggered everything in Colombia was because of the financial results of the government during COVID-19. So there you have a direct connection of this worldwide event and the riots here in Colombia. And then you also have, as you know, Colombia is a very agricultural dependent economy, and the price of fertilizers have gone through the roof because of the Ukraine war. So everything here that depends on agricultural as well, the prices have gone through the roof for the people living in the country.
So inflation generally across most markets is, if not the number one risk, it's a top risk this year. And, it does tend to affect those at the poorer fringes of society most. Could that be acting in countries like the ones we've talked about? Could inflation be acting as a pressure cooker for PV?
When people have their budgets and their cash flow affected, it brings a high level of uncertainty and unrest into population. When one day to another you get higher prices of basic food, gasoline, all the basic needs, and the people start not having enough for their day-to-day budget, then unrest happens and they start rioting against the government. And just one little thing that is changed by the government or by an international situation can cause unrest in these countries. And as mentioned before, one little situation can become a huge event because of social media and all that. So yeah, I think that right now in the region, at least in Latin America, all these countries are like a pressure cooker. One little spark can make everything blow up.
This is not just a Central South America issue. If we're talking worldwide here, I mean, you're seeing vast striking and protesting going on in the UK. The only real differences between the UK and certain territories in Latin America is that generally our protesting is quite peaceful. And we don't see the property damage that other countries see. But that goes back to the uncertainty of our product and why people are buying it. Because who's to say that in a year's time, there's a switch in the UK and it does turn aggressive? Even if you take France, the government changed or tried to change in regards to their policies, and we saw, vast rioting and striking there. So this is not just a Latin America issue. This is a European issue. And again, just to go back to COVID, a lot of what's going on with economies and governments today is because of COVID and the amount of recessions and stuff that COVID's caused. So I think we are seeing a sort of worldwide pressure cooker in a lot of territories.
We've seen a lot of changes in government in recent years. So there are quite a few left-wing administrations come to power in Chile, in Brazil, Peru, Colombia. In the context of things like COVID, have they been making some big promises, raising expectations? And could that be unrealistic expectations?
Yeah, they certainly have, right? So typically, a left-leaning politician will always have a very strong social agenda. The fiscal spending during COVID went through the roof. In Latin America, the governments rule, but then people like the IMF and the World Bank have huge influence, right? Because we need to lend or borrow money all the time. So once the fiscal spending or debt goes over 3% of GDP, then austerity measures start kicking in. And I think most countries right now are completely overspent because of the fight against COVID-19. So it does have a massive issue. And just kind of like quickly going back to the topic of inflation, because it's kind of related. I think that one of the particularities of Latin America that makes it slightly different than from the rest of the world, where inflation has a big problem, is that we are a very entrepreneurial society. So the level of informal economy in Latin America is very, very big. And there's a lot of like retail and basically shops and sales and food. So when inflation goes up, obviously families suddenly starts cutting back on their spending. And that generates a trickle-down effect, but in the negative way, because suddenly the business starts selling less. And most of these families actually don't have more than, at best, a week worth of savings, to survive the business. So a lot of the business are very prone to go bankrupt very, very quickly once you have an uptick in inflation, if people start spending less. So that's really where you start seeing a lot of social unrest, because people, they need to eat, right? So I always say that, James Carville in the election between Bill Clinton and Bush first said it, it's the economy stupid. And in Latin America, those words cannot be any truer. It's the economy stupid. If the economy is not doing well, buckle up, because we will have trouble.
Is the pendulum going to swing the other way? Are you going to get right-wing administrations in? And, either way, someone's going to be discontented by that.
Some of the most recent polls actually suggest that it's not even a problem of left or right. It's just a problem of people are just fed up with politicians. So that's why the pendulum keeps swinging. I saw one recently that, how much do people like democracy in Ecuador? And I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was under 25% or 20% of people said that they were pro-democracy now in Ecuador. I think places like Colombia as well are seeing those figures. So I think that the pendulum will continue to swing. But there is also, which is probably right now some of the most likely to happen nowadays. So you're starting to see it already with Bukele in El Salvador, and now possibly with Milei in Argentina, right? There's basically sort of like outcast, outsiders coming into the political arena, promising different things and just not being your standard politician or claiming not to be a politician. So in some instances, that may work. In some other ones, it may not. But I think that type of political candidate will become a lot more prevalent because, again, I don't think people at this stage are fed up with specifically with the left or with the right. They're just fed up with their lifestyle and with the high level of corruptions that typically happen in Latin America.
So looking at which countries are more vulnerable, where do you see a combination of the basic underlying factors that tend to result in PV?
Yeah, so in 2019, I started, being the nerd that I am, started trying to find common denominators across all the different social unrest happening in the world, right? Because 2019, this podcast specifically of LatAm, but we cannot forget that we have Hong Kong, we have Lebanon, we have France, and the US and other places around the world. And what I found is that there is, for the most part, three specific factors, right? So high levels of inequality, which we already touched upon, also fiscal debt and corruption. So if you see, inequality, to bring it up specifically on Chile, it turned out that Chile actually is probably in the top 20 of unequal countries in the world. We never really thought about that, trying to understand as to what happened. But, Chile happened to be highly unequal. And then also government debt. So again, the 3% dash. So they were over that, and that usually triggers austerity measures. So if you have two of these factors present, you're more likely to have a social unrest present, right? So a high perception of corruption, a high level of inequality, or a high government debt. So with this in mind, if you look at Latin America and across Latin America, I think most countries are on that list really, or probably have two, if not in some instances, three of the three factors. But the one that I would say it's definitely on my radar, it's two really. It's Ecuador and Argentina. Ecuador, the images of this past week during the presidential election, seeing presidential candidates wearing bulletproof vests and helmets, I think it's something that in Latin America we hadn't seen in a while. And, the assassination of the presidential candidate, Villavicencio, I think the last time that happened was in Mexico, really, in the 90s. So we really are going back at least 25, almost 30 years with Colosio. So organized crime is taking over. Social conditions, obviously businesses are starting to suffer and security have completely deteriorated. And then Argentina is always a sui generis, right? Because as any Argentinian will tell you, they're used to having crises, right? They say that they live in a 10-year cycle, and every 10 years there will be something happening. But this time around, what happened with Milei coming up, which again is not a traditional politician, I think that his measures can be quite radical and damaging, if you want to, economically in the short term. And, I'm not backing or dissing his political agenda, but, what the analysts say is that some of his proposals can cause a lot of social unrest in the short term, because he's trying to implement even more austere measures than those proposed by the IMF to Argentina. So I think it's two countries that we just need to keep on the radar and watch.
Wow, that was quite a discussion. I hope it provided you with some valuable insight into the region and some of the potential triggers to watch out for PV. Because the frequency and severity of LatAm political violence activity in recent years has been remarkable. It's astonishing that you can get more insured losses from SRCC or PV or however it's packaged than from natural catastrophe exposed business for some territories. We've heard the risk environment described as a pressure cooker. Whether it's Argentina or Ecuador or Colombia, Chile or Peru, there are plenty of warning signs, and the strong likelihood is that we'll continue to see civil unrest, protests, the pernicious effects of organised crime and corruption, and popular dissatisfaction with politicians and income inequality. The next episode will focus on the consequences of the closure of Ukraine's Black Sea grain corridor and its potential destabilising impact on African economies. So please stay tuned, follow, like and subscribe. You've been listening to the Political Risk Podcast, hosted by me, David Benyon. My guests were Napoleon Montes-Amaya from Hiscox Miami, Tom Bradbrook from Howden, based in London, and Mario Andrés Salcedo from Howden in Bogotá. Production by Peter McGill and music by Lawrence Durkin.